Hi, welcome back to Case Brief's LSAT course. My name is Sean Murphy. Today's lesson 9, we're going to talk about assumption questions. Assumption questions in logical reasoning can be divided into two question types: necessary assumption and sufficient assumption. We're going to start talking about necessary assumption questions. Here's some examples of the phrasings of necessary assumption question stems. The commentator's argument relies on which of the following assumptions? The official's conclusion logically depends on which of the following assumptions? Which of the following is an assumption made in drawing the conclusion above, or just the argument assumes? So in the first two examples, we had keywords that indicated a necessary condition: relies on, depends on. Or if they just ask you for an assumption that's definitely there, like the argument assumes, and then blank, you give your answer choices, that's asking for something that the argument definitely did, a required assumption of that argument. A necessary assumption of an argument is required for the conclusion to be true. The conclusion implies the truth of the assumption. If that assumption is not true, the conclusion falls apart. By the contrapositive, if the conclusion requires the assumption, if the assumption were not true, the conclusion would not be true. This means we have a very powerful tool to test whether or not a statement or an answer choice is a necessary assumption of a conclusion. We can use something called the denial test. We negate the answer choice. If the negation of the answer choice destroys the argument, then we know that that's a necessary condition of the argument, and therefore it's a necessary assumption, and therefore it's our correct answer. Let's consider the following argument. Joe is a Canadian. Therefore, Joe probably likes jazz. And let's say we had two answer choices for a necessary assumption question. A, some Canadians like jazz, or B, all Canadians like jazz. Now these are very similar, but we can use the denial test to figure out whether or not one of these two answer choices is actually necessary. So if I have the statement, some Canadians like jazz, and I want to negate that, some, which means one or more, becomes none. Or in this case, no. So it would be no Canadian likes jazz. Well, that negation, no Canadian likes jazz, destroys the argument, because if no Canadian likes jazz, then it's impossible for Joe to like jazz. So the conclusion that Joe probably likes jazz is an invalid conclusion. So this would be the correct answer. Now let's take a look at the second example I gave you, all Canadians like jazz. The negation of all is not all. Not all Canadians like jazz. We could also say some Canadians do not like jazz, or some not. That's equal to not all. Now this negation doesn't destroy the argument. Just because there's some Canadians that don't like jazz, it could still be reasonable to conclude that Joe probably does. I don't know if those Canadians that don't like jazz, if that's more than 50% or less than 50%. Some is deliberately vague. It means one or more. So the negation of the second potential assumption doesn't destroy the argument. Therefore, we can say for sure it's not a necessary condition of the argument's conclusion. Some people would negate all to none, and that's incorrect. All and none are not logical opposites, they're polar opposites. When doing a negation, you don't want to make your negation too extreme, because then you might make a wrong answer look correct. If we took this all and made it none or no, then we make this incorrect answer choice look like a correct one. So you should learn some common negations, which we'll go over now. Some really common logical negations you'll need to know are some versus none, all versus not all, or some not. It's the same thing. Could versus cannot. Or must be true versus not necessarily true. When doing a negation, most of the time it's fine just to add or take away the word not from the main verb of the sentence. You never touch a subordinate clause when doing a negation. So if the sentence is if it's raining, the sidewalk gets wet, you never touch the if clause when doing a negation. You say, if it's raining, the sidewalk does not get wet. Now, most of the time, it's fine just to add the word not or take it away if there's already a negative word in the sentence. But consider this example. Some musicians are wealthy. Now, if you tried to negate this and said some musicians are not wealthy, that wouldn't be a negation. That wouldn't contradict this original sentence because those two sentences are compatible. Some musicians are wealthy, some musicians are not wealthy. The first sentence doesn't imply the truth of the second. If some musicians are wealthy, we don't know if some of them are not. It's a possibility. But a negation should contradict the original sentence. If you're confused about how to do a negation, just say to yourself, this sentence isn't true. It is not true that some musicians are wealthy. Well, if that is not true, then you can definitely say that none of them are, because the logical negation of some is none. When you do a negation, you're actually changing the strength of the statement. Remember I talked about weak versus strong statements when I discussed that hierarchy of strength? Well, some is a very weak word, but when you negate it, it becomes a very strong one, none. All is a very strong word. When you negate it, it becomes a much weaker statement, not all. When doing necessary assumptions, we should also consider that they're passive questions, that the correct answer must be implied by the argument above. So really strong language can be problematic. If you have really strong language in an answer choice, but not strong language in the argument itself, then that's an incorrect answer. But when you negate a very weak answer choice, it becomes strong. And that's a good thing for that answer choice, because that means that it will potentially severely weaken the argument, making it more likely to be an actual necessary condition of the argument's conclusion.